Why did the air in the room feel like it was about to break? Maya Chun stood just inside the doorway of conference room B, the smell of old coffee and floor polish hanging heavy. The faces around the table turned toward her like a jury that had already reached its verdict. 5 men, each built like a wall, each wearing the same faint smirk, and at the head of the table, Colonel Briggs. She'd heard the stories about him, a man who measured strength by weight, respect by rank, and worth by gender. Today, she could see in his eyes, he wasn't here to test her. He was here to erase her. Her instincts prickled. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught her to read a room the way others read a map. This wasn't a meeting. This was an ambush without the bullets. And still, she stayed standing, refused the chair, kept her breathing steady. If they wanted her off balance, they'd have to work harder. Briggs circled her like a slow-moving storm, tossing words meant to sound official, but dripping with something colder. Your combat effectiveness has been questioned. He let the pause hang just long enough to sting. He spoke of fair evaluations, controlled demonstrations. He gestured toward the 5 men, Morrison, Williams, Johnson, Martinez, Rodriguez, introducing them the way. A showman might introduce the main act, and then he said it. The condition, no weapons, no gear, no rifle, just her. Against them, it should have been insulting. It was. But something else was forming under the surface, quiet, focused, coiled. How? Do you fight when everything that defines you is stripped away? She set her rifle on the table, the sound ringing sharp in the small room. One by one, her sidearm, her tactical gear, her armor followed. To Briggs, it was her surrender. To her, it was sharpening the blade. The 5 men shifted, their presence. Pressing in, Morrison bounced on his toes, all muscle and weight, but already betraying his balance. Williams stood wide and solid, his frame built for lifting, not turning. Johnson's right knee favored, his aggression barely leashed Martinez. Crouch low, wrestler's stance perfect, predictable, and Rodriguez steady, patient, eyes locked on her center. The only one who moved like a real threat. Maya's mind mapped them like targets on a sniper's scope. Not to kill, just to end it quickly. To survive without surrender. Outside the cracked door, boots shuffled. Word was already spreading. What happens when the predator underestimates the prey? Briggs' hand came down. Morrison charged like a freight train. In another life, she might have let him hit. Not today. She slipped left, weightless, redirecting his momentum the way her grandmother had taught her. His massive frame crashed into the conference table, splintering it, gasping, humiliated, out in 12 seconds. Williams and Johnson came next opposite angles. Pincer trap. She ducked so low their strikes cut only air, slid inside Williams' guard, and drove a palm strike into his solar plexus. The breath left him instantly. Johnson lunged for her blind side, but her leg swept back, catching his weak knee. The cry that followed wasn't anger, it was pain. Seconds gone, 3 down. When the perfect move meets the wrong opponent, what happens? Martinez came in textbook low, fast, committed to the double-leg takedown. She stepped into him instead of away, using his drive against him. His body lifted, turned, and hit the far wall before he knew what had happened. He slid down in it. Daze, not beaten by strength, but by timing. Only Rodriguez remained, his approach cautious. Dangerous. He feinted high, shot low for her ankle. Smart? Targeted? But she'd fought on terrain where one bad step meant dying. She pulled her leg clear, caught him mid-motion, and her knee found his face in one brutal, clean arc. He was out before the floor caught him. The room went still. The timer on Briggs' phone read 41 seconds. She wasn't even breathing hard. What do you say when there's nothing left to prove? She looked at Briggs. Sir, would you like me to continue the demonstration, or should we call it complete? Her voice was calm. Around them, the wreckage told its own story. 5 men down, One woman standing, untouched. Tank Morrison's laugh broke the silence. Not mocking this time, but something close to respect. "Holy hell," he breathed. "I got taken down by someone who weighs less than my gym bag." She moved among them, checking injuries, answering questions. Her techniques came from a lifetime Aikido. At 5, boxing at 12, the course after that. And mostly, she said, from people who'd actually tried to kill her. How fast does a private fight become everyone's story? The door opened wider. Captain Sarah Mitchell entered, phone in hand. "Sergeant Chun," she said. "You should know this was live-streamed. 50,000 views already." Maya's stomach sank. She'd wanted this to stay contained, but Mitchell wasn't here to reprimand her. The Pentagon wanted to talk. So did the Secretary of Defense, CNN, and 30 training facilities. Briggs tried to claim the fight was private, unauthorized. Mitchell cut him down with regulation and a single line. His methods were under investigation. The balance in the room shifted. Maya wasn't on trial anymore. He was. What if the people who tried to break you asked to be taught? Rodriguez extended his hand. Morrison admitted he'd been wrong. One by one, they asked to learn, to train, to understand what they'd just seen. And to her surprise, Maya said yes. They'd tested her. They'd given her real opponents with real styles. That kind of training was rare. She wasn't about to waste it. 6 weeks later, she wore a new rank, Master Sergeant, and a new title, Director of Advanced Combat Training for the Western Command. The 5 men became her first cadre. Briggs vanished into a desk job in logistics, and the Chun method began spreading through Special Forces units worldwide. What if your real victory isn't the fight you win, but the ones you inspire? On her first official day in the role, a young female recruit approached, nervous but determined. "I saw the video," she said. "They told me I was too small to fight, but after you." "I want to learn," Maya smiled, remembering the river and mountain her grandmother had spoken of. "Size isn't strength," she said. "Technique is strength. Intelligence is strength. And believing in yourself is the strongest weapon you'll ever carry." The legend of the 83-second fight would grow in the telling. But the truth, the part Maya carried quietly, was simpler. The fight had never been about proving she could win. It was about showing that in the right hands, even the smallest fighter could change the rules entirely. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why does the sound of metal on wood feel heavier than it should? Maya Chun set her rifle on the table. Not tossed, not placed, set. The barrel caught the harsh fluorescent light and sent a brief glint into Carl Briggs's eyes before fading into the dull graying of the conference table. The sound of flat, solid clank rolled into the corners of the room and stayed there. Like it didn't want to leave, it was the rifle she'd carried across 3 tours. The one her hands knew so well she could disassemble it blindfolded, in the dark, under fire. It had been with her on a mountain ridge at 2 a.m. in a marketplace. Turned battlefield, in the deep silence before dawn when she'd sighted in on a target that never saw her. Every inch of it held the weight of decisions she'd made, people she'd saved, and some she hadn't. She placed her sidearm beside it, the holster strap flapping once before falling still. Then her tactical vest, heavy with habit more than gear. Her knife, standard issue but worn down to fit her hand like an extension of her will. Piece by piece, she left them on the table until all that remained between her and the 5 men was the air. To Briggs, it was compliance. To Maya, it was the exact opposite. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice, from a world far away from this fluorescent-lit theater. When the current strips the boat, the oars, the sail you swim, and you swim as if the river is yours. The men adjusted, ever so slightly. Tank Morrison shifted his stance, the floor creaking beneath his weight. His sheer size made the space feel smaller, his shadow long on the wall behind him. Williams leaned his weight onto one left leg. Forward, She noted his arms loose but ready. Johnson kept rolling his shoulders, the tension in his jaw almost a tremor. Martinez's eyes tracked her feet, calculating angles for a takedown before the fight had even started, and Rodriguez didn't look at her feet or her eyes. He watched her centerline, waiting for the smallest break in rhythm. She let her gaze move over them like she was counting equipment. Not too slow, not too fast, just enough to let them know she saw everything, that she wasn't here to play out. Their plan, outside, the corridor was alive with movement. She could hear boots on tile, the scrape of a chair being pulled closer to the cracked door, the kind of low, curious murmuring that happens when soldiers catch wind of something they're not supposed to see but refuse to miss. Briggs didn't seem to notice or care. His voice had that rehearsed evenness of a man who thought he was still in control. "This is a controlled sparring match," he said. "Close quarters. You have 90 seconds to demonstrate readiness. They have the same time to evaluate. 90 seconds. She'd done more in 20. She kept her expression neutral, but inside, she was already adjusting. 90 seconds was generous. More than generous, it was a luxury. Briggs gestured at the 5 men like they were a set of tools. These soldiers represent different strengths, different challenges. No, she thought. They represent 5 different blind spots. Morrison was all forward momentum. No ability to stop. Williams had power, but it was rooted. Roots could be pulled. Johnson had speed, but it was wounded speed. Martinez was predictable in his perfection. And Rodriguez, he was the only real unknown. That meant he'd go last. Her mind began to stack the sequence like a sniper's shot list order of engagement. Angles of approach, anticipated reactions. She'd never fought all 5 before. Not in this kind of space. Afghanistan had taught her to read open ground. Here, the walls changed everything. Corners meant choke points. A table could be an obstacle or a weapon. Chairs were hazards to movement, unless you made them part of the plan. She stepped into the center of the room. Letting them close the circle, the air shifted. Whatever this was, it was now happening. Her breathing slowed. Her vision tunneled just enough to keep them all in frame. A habit born from rooftop overwatch. Always see the whole, never fix on. The one somewhere deep in her muscle memory. The old drills clicked into place. Don't meet strength with strength. Meet it with direction. Don't move where they expect. Move where they've left space. Her palms felt warm. Her spine felt like steel. This wasn't a fight she'd chosen, but it was a fight she'd already won. The moment Rodriguez went down, the air changed. It wasn't the crash. There wasn't much of one. His body didn't slam against furniture or walls the way Morrison's and Martinez's had. The sound was quieter, shorter, sharper, the blunt thunk of her knee meeting the side of his head, followed by the dull drop of him hitting the floor. But the silence that followed, it was heavy enough to hear. Outside, the hallway's low buzz stilled for the first time since the fight began. Faces pressed to the doorframe froze in mid-expression. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Inside the room, the only movement came from the small, unconscious rise and fall of Rodriguez's chest. Maya stood exactly where she'd been when the strike landed. Weight balanced, breathing steady, eyes sweeping the room without rush. She could feel their shock like heat radiating off concrete in the sun. 41 seconds. That's all it had taken. 5 men, each one larger, heavier, and by conventional standards, more dangerous than her now sat, slumped or lay still on the floor. None of them could continue. She wasn't even winded. She caught Morrison's eye first. He was still half sprawled across the collapsed conference table. One big hand braced against the splintered wood. He was trying to get up, but it wasn't his body holding him back. It was something else, something quieter. For just a second, his expression broke. Gone was the easy grin he'd worn before the fight, the unspoken confidence that she'd fold under weight and power. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was recognition. She gave him the smallest shake of her head, nothing aggressive, nothing mocking, just enough to say, "Don't. Not again." And he listened. Morrison settled back against the table, letting out a long breath that was half sigh, half laugh. Williams was still gasping, the slow, dragging breaths of someone whose body had momentarily forgotten how to work. His broad chest rose and fell like a bellows. Johnson lay on his side, hand gripping his knee as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Martinez was upright now, but leaning against the wall, blinking slowly, his mind still catching up to what had just happened. Rodriguez didn't move at all. She let her gaze sweep over them once, not to intimidate, but to read them the way she'd read rooms overseas, to see who was watching her, with anger, who with disbelief, and most importantly, who with respect. Colonel Briggs's timer ticked on, each second pulling the room tighter. 48, 47, 46. "Sir," she said finally, voice even, "would you like me to continue the demonstration, or should we call it complete?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't even particularly defiant. It was just calm, the kind of calm that comes from someone who doesn't need the approval of the person in charge to know what they've done. Briggs's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words. Tank Morrison's laugh broke the stillness like a crack in ice. It wasn't loud at first, more a wheeze through the leftover shock, but it built, spilling into something genuine. "Holy hell," he breathed, shaking his head. "I just got taken down by someone who weighs less than my gym bag." That drew a couple of half smiles from the others, reluctant but real. Not camaraderie, not yet, but the first sign of it. Maya didn't answer. She just stepped forward, crouched by Rodriguez, and gently turned his head, checking for signs of concussion. His pupils were sluggish but even. She rolled him carefully to his side so his airway stayed clear. She moved next to Johnson, who was still clutching his knee. Her hands were quick but careful, testing for swelling. Range of motion, painful, yes. Permanent, no. Williams had managed to sit up now, though every breath still looked like work. He caught her eye. "That thing you did to my chest," he said between gasps. "I couldn't breathe for 30 seconds, thought I was dying." "Pressure points strike to the phrenic nerve," she said, matter of fact. "Temporarily shuts down the diaphragm. You weren't in danger." A pause. Uncomfortable, though. He let out something between a laugh and a cough. That's one word for it. Martinez was rubbing his shoulder now, testing it like he wasn't sure it was still connected. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but steady. "I've been wrestling since I was 8. I've never been thrown like that." "What was that?" "Judo hip toss variation," she said, still moving, still checking on them. "Modified for combat. Wrestling's about control. Combat's about ending the threat fast. Different goals, different tools." The room was starting to breathe. Again, not just physically, but in presence. The initial shock was settling into something else. Curiosity, respect, and maybe the first hints of regret. Out in the hallway, someone whispered, "Is this for real?" Another voice, sharper, more certain, answered, "You saw it. It's real." The crack in the door widened. A half dozen more faces leaned in, eyes wide. Cell phones discreetly angled toward the scene. Maya caught the shift, knew exactly what it meant. This was no longer a private humiliation. It was a story, and not the one Briggs had planned. The colonel's face had gone red. His jaw set so hard it looked like it might break. His eyes flicked from her to the men on the floor, to the phones in the hallway, and back to her. She knew what he was thinking. Damage control. Narrative spin. The pieces were already moving in his head, but she also knew something he didn't. Once a story like this escaped containment, you couldn't drag it back. It would move through the base faster than an official memo. It would change in the telling, details stretching, embellishments growing, but the core of it would remain untouched. A woman, 5 men, less than a minute and a half. And it wasn't over yet. The moment Rodriguez went down, the air changed. It wasn't the crash. There wasn't much of one. His body didn't slam against furniture or walls the way Morrison's and Martinez's had. The sound was quieter, shorter, sharper, the blunt thunk of her knee meeting the side of his head, followed by the dull drop of him hitting the floor. But the silence that followed, it was heavy enough to hear. Outside, the hallway's low buzz stilled for the first time since the fight began. Faces pressed to the doorframe froze in mid-expression. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Inside the room, the only movement came from the small, unconscious rise and fall of Rodriguez's chest. Maya stood exactly where she'd been when the strike landed. Weight balanced, breathing steady, eyes sweeping the room without rush. She could feel their shock like heat radiating off concrete in the sun. 41 seconds. That's all it had taken. 5 men, each one larger, heavier, and by conventional standards more dangerous than her now sat, slumped or lay still on the floor. None of them could continue. She wasn't even winded. She caught Morrison's eye first. He was still half sprawled across the collapsed conference table. One big hand braced against the splintered wood. He was trying to get up, but it wasn't his body holding him back. It was something else, something quieter. For just a second, his expression broke. Gone was the easy grin he'd worn before the fight, the unspoken confidence that she'd fold under weight and power. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was recognition. She gave him the smallest shake of her head, nothing aggressive, nothing mocking, just enough to say, "Don't, not again." And he listened. Morrison settled back against the table, letting out a long breath that was half sigh, half laugh. Williams was still gasping, the slow, dragging breaths of someone whose body had momentarily forgotten how to work. His broad chest rose and fell like a bellows. Johnson lay on his side, hand gripping his knee as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Martinez was upright now, but leaning against the wall, blinking slowly, his mind still catching up to what had just happened. Rodriguez didn't move at all. She let her gaze sweep over them once, not to intimidate, but to read them the way she'd read rooms overseas, to see who was watching her. With anger, who with disbelief, and most importantly, who with respect. Colonel Briggs's timer ticked on, each second pulling the room tighter. 48, 47, 46. "Sir," she said finally, voice even, "would you like me to continue the demonstration, or should we call it complete?" Her tone wasn't mocking. It wasn't even particularly defiant. It was just calm. The kind of calm that comes from someone who doesn't need the approval of the person in charge to know what they've done. Briggs's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words. Tank Morrison's laugh broke the stillness like a crack in ice. It wasn't loud at first, more a wheeze through the leftover shock, but it built, spilling into something genuine. "Holy hell," he breathed, shaking his head. "I just got taken down by someone who weighs less than my gym bag." That drew a couple of half smiles from the others. Reluctant but real. Not camaraderie, not yet. But the first sign of it, Maya didn't answer. She just stepped forward, crouched by Rodriguez, and gently turned his head, checking for signs of concussion. His pupils were sluggish but even. She rolled him carefully to his side so his airway stayed clear. She moved next to Johnson, who was still clutching his knee. Her hands were quick but careful, testing for swelling. Range of motion, painful, yes. Permanent, no. Williams had managed to sit up now. Though every breath still looked like work, he caught her eye. "That thing you did to my chest," he said between gasps. "I couldn't breathe for 30 seconds, thought I was dying." "Pressure points strike to the phrenic nerve," she said, matter of fact. "Temporarily shuts down the diaphragm. You weren't in danger." A pause. Uncomfortable, though. He let out something between a laugh and a cough. "That's one word for it." Martinez was rubbing his shoulder now. testing it like he wasn't sure it was still connected. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but steady. "I've been wrestling since I was 8. I've never been thrown like that." "What was that?" "Judo hip toss variation," she said, still moving, still checking on them. "Modified for combat. Wrestling's about control. Combat's about ending the threat fast. Different goals, different tools." The room was starting to breathe. Again, not just physically, but in presence. The initial shock was settling into something else. Curiosity, respect, and maybe the first hints of regret. Out in the hallway, someone whispered, "Is this for real?" Another voice, sharper, more certain, answered, "You saw it. It's real." The crack in the door widened. A half-dozen more faces leaned in, eyes wide. Cell phones discreetly angled toward the scene. Maya caught the shift, knew exactly what it meant. This was no longer a private humiliation. It was a story, and not the one Briggs had planned. The colonel's face had gone red. His jaw set so hard it looked like it might break. His eyes flicked from her to the men on the floor, to the phones in the hallway, and back to her. She knew what he was thinking. Damage control. Narrative spin. The pieces were already moving in his head, but she also knew something he didn't. Once a story like this escaped containment, you couldn't drag it back. It would move through the base faster than an official memo. It would change in the telling, details stretching, embellishments growing, but the core of it would remain untouched. A woman, 5 men, less than a minute and a half. And it wasn't over yet. It started with the sound of boots, not in the room, out in the hallway. A steady, uneven rhythm, the kind of shuffle you get when a crowd grows in a space too small to hold it. It wasn't just a few soldiers anymore. The air beyond the cracked. Door had thickened, dozens, maybe. Maya caught flashes through the narrow gap camouflage sleeves pressed shoulder to shoulder. Faces stacked in layers, some craning for a better view. The low hum of their voices was like static, words too soft to catch, but weighted with the same question. Did that really just happen? Briggs heard it too. His head jerked toward the door, eyes narrowing at the intrusion. His hand twitched like he might slam it shut. Reclaim the space, but he didn't move. Not yet. He was calculating, trying to decide whether sealing the room would help his control or make it worse. The decision was made for him. The door swung open. Not a tentative crack this time, but a clean push, deliberate and unapologetic. Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped inside like she owned the place. She was dressed in service khakis, sleeves sharp, hair pinned back with precision. Her right hand held a phone angled slightly down, recording. The red dot in the corner of the screen pulsed with quiet authority. Behind her, the crowd shifted. At least a dozen soldiers now stood openly in the doorway. No pretense of just passing by. More were visible in the hall beyond. A chain of curious faces stretching into the corridor. Briggs's voice came out clipped. "Captain Mitchell, this is a private." She cut him off, polite but firm. "Sir, you'll want to know this was live-streamed." The words hit like a single, well-placed shot for a beat. The room was silent. Then Morrison, still perched on the wreckage of the conference table, let out a short, incredulous laugh. Williams turned his head toward the door, the ghost of a grin tugging at his mouth. Even Johnson, still clutching his knee, seemed to straighten slightly, as if curious where this was going. Maya didn't react. Outwardly, inside, her stomach tightened. She'd wanted this contained, handled through official channels where rules had weight and consequences could be measured. Out in the open, a story took on a life of its own. Mitchell stepped further into the room. 50,000 views so far, she continued, her tone almost conversational. In the last, she glanced at her phone. 7 minutes. 7 minutes. 50,000 people. The numbers weren't just statistics. They were velocity. This wasn't a spark waiting to catch. It was already burning, and somewhere out there, the footage of her dropping 5 men in under a minute was being replayed, rewatched, dissected frame by frame. Briggs's face flushed darker. This was an internal evaluation. Any recordings are unauthorized. Mitchell's head tilted slightly, the kind of tilt that says you don't have the high ground here. Actually, sir, under the new transparency guidelines for fitness evaluations, soldiers have the right to record any assessment that could affect their careers. Sergeant Chun's demonstration falls well within those parameters. Maya kept her face still, but the words landed. She hadn't known that detail, hadn't needed to, but Mitchell had, and she'd chosen to use it here. In front of everyone, the colonel opened his mouth again, but Mitchell wasn't finished. Also, sir, she said, scrolling her phone, the Inspector General's office has already requested a copy. Apparently, there are questions about your evaluation methods. This time, it wasn't just the air that shifted, it was the ground. The subtle balance of who was on trial here began to tip. Outside, the voices in the hall were louder now, no longer trying to mask themselves. Someone whispered, "Pentagon's gonna see this," followed by another voice, "Too late, they probably already have." Mitchell turned her attention to Maya for the first time. "Sergeant Chun," she said, her tone shifting to formal, professional. "The Secretary of Defense's office wants to speak with you. So does CNN and about 30 different military training facilities. You've apparently made an impression." Maya absorbed it quietly. No nod, no smile, no visible crack in the composure she'd worn since walking into the room. Inside, though, the information hit like a ripple in a still pond. This was no longer about defending her place in the unit. This was something much larger. Briggs shifted, the weight of the room's attention turning on him now. His jaw was tight, eyes darting toward the crowd at the door, the men on the floor, the phone still recording in Mitchell's hand. Whatever narrative he'd planned, whatever version of events he'd intended to leave behind, was already slipping beyond his control. Maya didn't gloat. She didn't even speak. She simply moved, checking once more on Rodriguez, then Johnson, then Williams, making sure they were stable. Injuries non-critical. Her restraint said more than victory ever could. No triumph, no taunting, just professionalism, the kind that cuts deeper than any blow. Morrison broke the silence first. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a mix of disbelief and respect, "where the hell did you learn to fight like that?" She looked at him, not pausing in her movement. "My grandmother started me in Aikido when I was 5. My father added boxing when I was 12. The Marine Corps taught me the rest." She adjusted Williams's posture so he could breathe easier, then added, "Mostly, I learned from people who wanted to kill me. They were very motivated teachers." Morrison nodded slowly, as if filing that away. Johnson, still rubbing his knee, managed a grin despite the pain. "Guess we didn't count on that part." Mitchell's phone beeped softly, a notification. She glanced at it, her eyebrows lifting just slightly. "Make that 65,000 views," she said, almost to herself. The crowd at the door shifted again, phones now visible in more than a few hands. The video wasn't just out, it was multiplying. Briggs finally spoke, his voice low but carrying enough for the room to hear. "This is not how things are done." Maya met his gaze. "No, sir," she said evenly. "It's not." And in that quiet agreement, the real shift happened, the kind you don't see on camera, but you feel. This was no longer his room. The room smelled faintly of sweat and broken furniture. The fight was over, but the echoes of it, boots scraping tile, the shudder of Morrison hitting the table, the sharp crack of her knee against Rodriguez's skull, still hung in the air like the dust motes drifting in the light. The 5 men were in varying states of recovery. Morrison had pushed himself up to sitting, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed, as if replaying every second of his loss. Williams sat with his back against the wall, breath finally evening out, the red flush fading from his face. Johnson was propped on one elbow, his other hand still clutching the knee she'd swept. Testing it like a mechanic assessing damage, Martinez had his legs stretched out, one hand rotating his sore shoulder. Rodriguez, now conscious, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a small strip of gauze pressed to his temple where skin had split on impact. For a few beats, no one spoke. The noise from the hallway was still there, but softer now, like the crowd outside sensed something had shifted. It was Rodriguez who broke the silence. His voice was steady, though his words came slower than usual. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been fighting professionally for 8 years. My army combatives, you name it. I've never seen anyone do what you just did." His tone wasn't defensive, it wasn't begrudging, it was curious. Then came the question, would you be willing to teach some of those techniques? The others looked at him, then at her. Morrison straightened slightly. Williams's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with interest. Even Johnson's head tilted as if waiting for her answer. Maya stood in the center of them all, hands loose. At her sides, posture neither defensive nor dominant. She looked at Rodriguez for a long moment before answering. "You want to learn?" He nodded once. Her gaze moved to Morrison. "You?" The big man gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I want to know how you saw through me before I even moved." Williams gave a half smile. "I want to know how you shut me down without even looking like you tried." Martinez rolled his shoulder again. "And I want to know how to throw someone with that much speed without losing control." Even Johnson, still rubbing his knee, managed a grin. "And I want to know how to make that sweep without blowing my own leg out." For the first time since stepping into the room, Maya let the faintest trace of a smile touch her face. It wasn't pride, it wasn't victory. It was recognition of something she hadn't expected to find here. "You all taught me something too," she said quietly. 5 different styles, 5 different approaches, forced me to adapt in real time. That's training I can't get. In a gym, Captain Mitchell was still recording, but her phone lowered slightly now, almost as if she understood this part wasn't for the public, it was for them. Morrison leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "So, will you train us?" Maya's eyes flicked briefly toward Briggs. The colonel's jaw was still locked tight, but he said nothing. His silence was its own kind of permission, or at least an inability to deny it in this moment. "Yes," she said. Simply. The energy in the room changed again, not in a sudden burst, but in the slow, steady shift of something breaking loose like ice melting into water. These weren't opponents anymore. Not exactly. They were soldiers looking at another soldier and seeing something worth learning from. She stepped toward Rodriguez first, helping him to his feet. "You came in with the right approach," she said, balanced, patient. "But you kept watching my center line without adapting when I shifted rhythm. You need to train for unpredictability." Rodriguez nodded. Absorbing it like a man collecting tools, she moved to Morrison. "Your size is a weapon, but it's only as effective as your ability to stop it. You overcommit. Learn to feint draw me where you want me before you strike." To Williams, "You rely on static power. That works in the gym. In a fight, it makes you a target. Work on mobility, footwork drills, shadow movement without the weight load." To Johnson, "You've got speed, but speed without stability is a liability. Your knee," she tapped it gently, "isn't just an injury, it's a tell. Train to disguise it, or someone like me will find it every time." To Martinez, "Your stance is perfect for the mat. But combat isn't about control, it's about ending threats. Loosen your grip on perfection, and you'll be harder to read." The men listened, not politely, not as a formality. They listened the way soldiers listen when they know the person speaking has proven themselves beyond question. Outside, the crowd's tone had shifted too. No longer the murmur of gossip. It was quieter, more focused, as if the audience understood they were witnessing something that wasn't about spectacle anymore. Mitchell finally slipped her phone into her pocket. "I think," she said softly, almost to herself, This might be the most productive evaluation Fort Carson's seen in a while. The training floor was quieter now. Late afternoon sunlight spilled through the tall windows in long, warm bands, cutting across the mats and catching the faint dust still hanging in the air. Most of the day's drills were done. Soldiers filtered out in 2s and 3s, their voices low, their movements slowed by fatigue. Somewhere in the corner, Morrison and Martinez were still running a light sparring match, the steady slap of mat underfoot keeping a rhythm. Maya stood at the edge of the room, her hands resting lightly on her hips, eyes following the movement of the remaining trainees. She'd like to end her days here, in the quiet after the noise, when the space held the echoes of effort but none of the posturing. That was when she noticed the girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. Small frame, uniform hanging just a little too loose at the shoulders. Her short dark hair tucked neatly under her cap. She stood half in shadow near the doorway, as if uncertain whether she belonged here at all. For a moment, Maya thought she might just be passing through, but the girl didn't move. She stayed there, watching, one hand gripping the strap of her gear bag so tightly her knuckles were pale. Maya stepped toward her, closing the distance until they were just a few feet apart. "You here for something?" The girl's chin lifted slightly, though her voice stayed soft. "Master Sergeant." "I saw the video." There was a pause just long enough for the unspoken truth to hang between them. Maya knew which video. Everyone knew by now. The girl swallowed. "They told me I was too small to be an effective soldier, that I'd never be able to keep up. But after I saw you," her grip on the strap tightened, "I want to learn everything you can teach me." Maya studied her face, nervous, yes, but steady. The kind of steady that comes from making a decision and standing in it, even when you're not sure how it'll be received. She saw herself in that steadiness. "You think size is going to stop you?" Maya asked. The girl shook her head quickly. "Not anymore." Maya let the silence stretch for a heartbeat. "Good," she said finally, "because size isn't strength. Technique is strength. Intelligence is strength, and believing in yourself." Her voice softened, almost like she was speaking to her younger self. "That's the strongest weapon you'll ever carry." The girl nodded, the smallest flicker of a smile breaking through. "Come back tomorrow at 0600, Maya said. "Bring your boots and an open mind." "Yes, ma'am." The girl left, her steps lighter than when she'd entered. Maya watched her go, the door closing behind her with a soft click around her. The training floor was almost empty now. The sun had shifted, the golden light turning softer, more diffused. She could still hear Morrison and Martinez in the far corner, laughing now. As they traded light blows, Williams was packing away gear. Johnson was leaning against the wall, stretching his knee with careful precision. Rodriguez was seated at the edge of the mat, watching the others with that quiet, analytical focus that had first caught her attention 6 weeks ago. These men, these same 5 who had once stood ready to prove she didn't belong, were now part of something entirely different, something bigger than all of them. She thought back to that day in Conference Room B, the smell of burnt coffee, the hum of the lights, Briggs's voice, full of that false politeness masking something colder. The feel of her rifle leaving her hands, the timer starting, the sound of Morrison's weight hitting the table, the shock in the eyes of soldiers crammed into the hallway. And she realized none of that had been the real victory. The real victory was here, in the way these men had chosen to learn instead of resent, in the way the Chun method was already moving beyond this base, in the way a young recruit had walked into this room today, not to ask if she could do it, but to say she was ready to try. She stepped onto the mat again, her boots whispering. Against the surface, the day's drills might have been over, but her work wasn't. From somewhere deep in memory, her grandmother's voice rose, the words as clear as if they'd been spoken in the room. "A river doesn't move mountains by being bigger than them." Maya had lived long enough to understand. The rest, it moved them by never stopping. She looked around at the emptying space, at her cadre, at the faint golden light painting the walls, and she felt the weight of what had started with just 83 seconds. In the end, it hadn't been about proving she could win. It had been about proving that the rules could change, and sometimes dignity doesn't speak. 6 weeks later, the room smelled different. Not the conference room. It had been repaired, repainted, its table replaced with something far sturdier. This was a new space entirely. The Western Command's advanced training facility, the air. Here carried the tang of fresh sweat, gun oil, and the faint metallic bite of the pull-up bars lining the far wall. Outside, the Colorado wind pushed against the windows in slow, deliberate gusts. The floor was marked with taped lanes, grappling mats, and stations for everything from close-quarters drills to weapons transition exercises. Soldiers moved through the space in groups, each focused, each with a trainer watching closely. And in the center of it all stood Master Sergeant Maya Chun. The new rank still felt strange on her chest, 4 chevrons and 2 rockers with a diamond in the middle. But it wasn't the insignia that felt heavier. It was the responsibility that came with the new title, Director of Advanced Combat Training for the Western Command. She'd taken the position with the same quiet resolve she'd brought into that fight 6 weeks earlier. But this was no evaluation. This was her domain now. The Fighting Conference Room B had done what no briefing, no award, no speech could have accomplished. It had turned whispered doubt into undeniable proof, and not just for the men who'd been there. The live stream had been replayed in mess halls, briefing rooms, and barracks across bases she'd never set foot on. It was dissected by training officers, debated by armchair tacticians online, and more than anything, remembered by anyone who'd ever been underestimated. The Chum method, as people had started calling it, wasn't hers alone, not in the way they thought. It was a synthesis. The flow her grandmother had taught her in Aikido, the economy of motion from her father's boxing lessons, the precision of Marine Corps' close-quarters combat, and the adaptability learned from years in places where one wrong decision meant someone didn't come home. Now, with the support of Special Forces trainers and tactical instructors from across the Western Command, she was shaping it into a formal curriculum. Technique over size, speed over strength, intelligence over aggression. Morrison was here too, and Williams and Johnson, Martinez and Rodriguez. They weren't just participants, they were her first cadre. The same 5 men who had once been handpicked to humiliate her now stood as the cornerstone of her new program. It hadn't been instant. The first week, they'd kept to themselves, doing the drills but keeping conversation light. By the second week, Morrison was cracking jokes again, this time without the bite. By the third, Johnson had started running his squad through some of her movement patterns, telling them it would save their knees in a fight. By the fourth, Martinez was quietly integrating her modified throws into his wrestling instruction. Now, in the 6th week, they were fully hers, not as subordinates, but as collaborators. They debated tactics with her, challenged her in sparring, and sometimes rarely won a point. And when they did, she made sure to study why Briggs was gone. Not officially disgraced people like him rarely were, but reassigned to a desk job in logistics somewhere far from the front line, far from influencing who got to serve and who didn't. The official reason cited strategic realignment. The unofficial truth was simpler. The Inspector General's investigation had found a pattern of discriminatory evaluation practices, and the Conference Room B incident had simply made it impossible to ignore. The men who'd once been his muscle? They were no longer as Mitchell stopped by the training floor that morning, her usual sharp uniform giving way to a soft-shell jacket and jeans off duty, but still carrying herself like a captain. She leaned on the railing above the mat area, watching as Maya moved through a series of sparring demonstrations. Pentagon wants an update, she called down between rounds. Apparently, The Marines have been using your training clips in some of their recruitment spots. You're about to get very popular." Maya gave her a half smile and a nod before flipping Rodriguez over her hip in one smooth motion, the man landing with a controlled thump and a grin. During the midday break, Morrison dropped onto the bench beside her, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "You ever think," he said, "that if Briggs had gotten what he wanted that day, none of this would exist?" She took a sip from her water bottle. "I think," she said slowly, "that he gave me exactly what I needed." Morrison's brow furrowed. "He brought 5 styles into one room," she continued. "Forced me to adapt under pressure. Proved the method works in real time, and he made sure everyone saw it." Williams joined them, shaking his head with a laugh. "Never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad I lost." Maya looked between them. "You didn't lose, you learned, and so did I." By the end of the day, she watched her cadre run drills with the new recruits, men and women, tall and short, built like tanks and built like runners. She saw them applying the same principles she'd used in that fight, reading weaknesses before engaging, using balance over brute force, ending the threat quickly without wasted movement. It wasn't about creating fighters who looked unstoppable. It was about creating fighters who were unstoppable in the ways that mattered most. And somewhere in the quiet, she knew the Chun method wouldn't stop here. It was already moving outward, shared in briefings, passed along in after-hours sparring sessions, adapted in units she'd never even meet.